The water was still that afternoon, flat and silver under the heavy October sky. From my porch I could see every ripple on Fairview Lake, every reflected cloud that drifted past. The air smelled faintly of rain and pine needles. I was pouring myself a cup of tea when I heard the sound of an engine fast, angry, wrong. A silver car shot out from the tree-lined tires, screeching as it skidded onto the dirt road by the lake. My daughter-in-law's car, Maya. My heart clenched. She'd been avoiding me for weeks, not answering calls, acting strange ever since the lawyer mentioned updating my will. I set down my cup, porcelain clinking against wood. The engine cut off, and for a moment there was silence so thick it felt alive. Then she stepped out, hair disheveled, face red, movements jerky. She looked over her shoulder once, twice, like someone running from ghosts. I leaned forward against the porch railing. In her hands was something large, heavy brown leather, glinting wet in the light. A suitcase. My suitcase, the one Daniel and I used on our honeymoon 50 years ago. I called her name, but the wind swallowed my voice. Maya staggered toward the water, her heels sinking into the mud, every step desperate. She swung the suitcase once, twice, and hurled it into the lake. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. Water exploded upward, then closed over it with a slow, final gulp. Maya stood staring at the ripples until they disappeared, then she ran back to the car, slammed the door and sped away. The dust swallowed her, leaving me with only the smell of exhaust and the echo of my own heartbeat. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My mind spun. What had she done? What was she hiding? The house felt suddenly too big, too empty. Daniel's portrait stared at me from the mantel, his eyes kind and steady, the same eyes our son inherited before the accident took him. "What have you gotten us into, Maya?" I whispered. Then, without thinking, I started down the porch steps. My knees protested, but adrenaline drowned the pain. The lake shimmered in front of me like a mirror hiding secrets. Each step felt slower, heavier, until I stood at the edge of the water. The ripples were spreading outward, faint but steady. The suitcase floated a few yards from shore, half submerged, the leather darkened and slick. I waded in without hesitation. The water bit cold into my skin, soaking through my skirt. Mud sucked at my shoes, pulling, resisting. The smell of damp algae clung to everything. I reached out, fingers trembling, and caught the handle. It was heavier than I imagined, like pulling a body. "Please no," I muttered through clenched teeth, pulling harder. My arms shook, the muscles burning, but finally it slid closer, scraping against the rocks near shore. That's when I heard it, a dull thump, from inside. Then another, muffled, faint, rhythmic. I froze. My throat went dry. "No," I breathed, "please God, no." My hands shook so badly I could barely grip the latch. It stuck. The water had swollen, the leather locking it tight. I clawed at it until my nails split, until the clasp finally gave with a metallic snap. I opened the lid, and the world went silent. Inside, wrapped in a soaked blanket, was something small, pale, and impossibly still. For a second, I couldn't tell what I was seeing. Then the blanket shifted, and a tiny hand fell free, white, limp, perfect. A baby. Maybe a few days old. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I lifted him, the blanket dripping between my fingers. His lips were blue, his chest unmoving. "No, no, no," I whispered, pressing him to my chest. His skin was icy. "Breathe, sweetheart, please breathe." I tilted his head, placed my ear near his nose. A faint sigh brushed my cheek, a breath so weak I almost missed it. "You're alive," I gasped. "Hold on." I ran half stumbling through the mud, clutching him tight. My shoes slipped, branches scratched my arms, but I didn't stop. My house stood up the hill, white paint peeling, curtains fluttering like worried ghosts. I burst inside, dripping water across the floor, slammed the phone off the hook, and dialed 911. My voice shook. "There's a baby, he's not breathing, please send help." The operator asked for my address, her calm voice, a rope keeping me from falling apart. "Wrap him in something warm," she said. I grabbed a towel from the counter, wrapped it around him, rubbed gently, prayed harder than I ever had in my life. "Stay with me," I begged. "Please don't go where your father went." The sirens came quicker than I expected. Red and blue lights painted the walls as two paramedics rushed through the door. The younger one, a woman with steady eyes, took the baby from me. She worked fast, checking his pulse, breathing into his tiny mouth, pressing 2 fingers against his chest. "He's alive," she said, finally. "Weak but alive." My knees gave out. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. The other medic asked questions I barely understood: where I found him, what time did I see anyone else. I told them about the silver car, the suitcase, Maya running. The woman glanced at me sharply. "Your daughter-in-law," I nodded. She didn't comment, but the look said everything. They lifted the baby into a small incubator box, connected tubes, wrapped him in wires that blinked green. "We're taking him to County General," the medic said. "You coming?" I nodded and climbed into the back of the ambulance. The road blurred by under the flashing lights. I stared at the baby, at the tiny rise and fall of his chest, at the fragile proof that he still belonged to this world. My thoughts kept looping: Maya, the suitcase, the will. What could possibly connect them? My son Daniel had been gone 6 months. His widow was supposed to be grieving, rebuilding. But grief didn't look like this. At the hospital they rushed him away behind swinging doors, leaving me in a chair outside the neonatal unit. My clothes clung wet to my skin. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. A nurse brought me a blanket and tea. "You saved him," she said softly. "Not everyone would have gone into that lake." I stared into the cup, steam rising, unable to speak. Because saving him didn't feel like heroism, it felt like a warning. That suitcase had been meant to disappear, to sink, and never be found. And if Maya had gone that far once, what else was she capable of? I looked through the glass window of the NICU, where doctors in white coats moved like ghosts around tiny incubators. The baby lay in one of them, a bundle of tubes and hope. Something inside me, something long dormant, stirred awake. My son was gone, my husband long before him. But this little one, this miracle pulled from the dark, was all that remained of my family. And if Maya wanted to bury the past, she had chosen the wrong woman to stop her. I pressed my hand against the cool glass, whispered to the small, fragile life on the other side. "You're safe now. I promise you no one will ever hurt you again." The waiting room was too bright. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, slicing through my skull. I'd been there for hours, sitting on a hard plastic chair, my wet clothes replaced by hospital scrubs that smelled faintly of bleach. I stared at the clock above the nurse's station, watching the minute hand crawl. Every time the door to the neonatal unit opened, my heart leapt, only to crash again when it wasn't for me. A nurse named Clara finally approached, her shoes squeaking against the tile. "Mrs. Ward," she asked gently. "He's stable for now. The doctors are running tests, but he's breathing on his own." I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until then. I pressed a hand to my chest, felt my heartbeat return like a drum under the surface. "Can I see him?" "Not yet," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Soon. He's fighting hard." When she left, I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. "Fighting hard. My son used to say that too. We'll fight through it, Mom." He said it after his father's funeral, after the layoffs, after everything. But he wasn't here to fight anymore. I was fighting alone against something I didn't even understand. The automatic doors hissed open. 2 police officers walked in, a woman with tight curls and steady eyes, and a younger man holding a notepad. "Mrs. Ward," the woman asked, flashing a badge. "Detective Laura Monroe. This is Officer Peters. We need to ask you a few questions." I nodded, motioning toward the chair beside me. She didn't sit. "You told the paramedics you saw your daughter-in-law, Maya Ward, near the lake this afternoon." "Yes," I said, the words tasting bitter. "She threw a suitcase into the water." "What time was this?" 5:15, I said immediately. The clock on the porch chimed just as I poured my tea. Laura scribbled something, then looked back up. "And you're certain it was her?" "She was driving her silver sedan. The one Daniel bought her." My throat tightened at his name. I'd recognize that car anywhere. "Did you see her face clearly?" "She looked frantic." I called her name, but she didn't turn around. Laura's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did she know you were there?" "I think so. Or maybe she didn't care." Peters flipped a page. "Mrs. Ward, do you have any idea what could have been inside the suitcase?" The question made my stomach twist. I didn't. My voice cracked. "A baby, a newborn." The young officer's pen froze mid-sentence. Laura's expression barely changed, but her voice softened. "Alive, barely." They said he's stable now. Lara nodded once, then closed her notebook. We'll need to take a formal statement in the morning. And Mrs. Ward, don't contact Maya. For your own safety. For mine, I asked. You think she'd hurt me? The detective's expression didn't waver. We don't know what she's capable of yet. They left me with a card that had her name and number on it. I stared at it long after they were gone, the edges dug into my palm. I kept seeing Maya's face in my mind, the red-rimmed eyes, the trembling hands, the way she hurled that suitcase like she was burying her own sins. I'd never liked her. From the day she walked into our lives, she carried something sharp behind her smile. Daniel used to say I was unfair that I didn't give her a chance. Maybe he was right. But now all I could think was how little I really knew about the woman who had shared his bed. The hours bled together. At some point, Pastor Reynolds arrived. Someone must have called him. He sat beside me without a word, folding his large hands in his lap. She's saying I'm crazy, I murmured, staring at the floor. That's what they'll think, isn't it? The grieving mother, losing her mind. He shook his head. They'll think you're a woman who saved a life. I looked up, my eyes burning. I don't even know whose life I saved. Does it matter? He asked. You did what was right. By dawn, the nurse returned. You can see him now. Her voice was kind, her smile tired. She led me down the hall through a set of glass doors. Machines beeped softly, monitors flickered green and blue. The baby lay in a small plastic crib, wrapped in white blankets, his chest rising and falling like the flutter of a bird's wing. Tiny tubes ran from his arms, a knitted cap covered his head. He's beautiful, I whispered. My throat tightened as I reached through the opening to touch his hand. It was so small it barely wrapped around my fingertip. He stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering. For a moment the whole world shrank to that single point of contact, his warmth faint but real. The doctor entered quietly. A young man with tired eyes and a voice that carried calm authority. Mrs. Ward, I'm Dr. Grayson. The baby's condition is improving. He was hypothermic and waterlogged, but there's no permanent damage so far. Will he live? He nodded. Yes, I believe so. It's a miracle, frankly. A few more minutes in that water and he didn't finish the sentence. Do you know who he is? I asked. Where he came from? He shook his head. We'll run a DNA test. But for now we're calling him Baby Lake on the chart. The name hit me like a stone. No, I said quietly. That's not right. He smiled gently. Then give him one. Something to call him until we know. I looked down at the baby again. Eli, I said after a moment. It means ascended. Dr. Grayson nodded. Eli, it is. When he left, I sat there tracing my eyes over the fragile lines of the baby's face. Somewhere between exhaustion and awe, I felt tears sliding down my cheeks. You're stronger than you look, I whispered. Just like your father. Then I froze. The word had slipped out unbidden, but it felt right. Somehow, deep in my bones, I knew this wasn't a stranger's child. He was blood mine Daniel's. The resemblance was faint but undeniable, the same dimple in the chin, the same tiny curl in the hair. Rhonda appeared in the doorway holding 2 paper cups of coffee. You're still here, she said softly. I couldn't leave him, I figured. She handed me a cup, then leaned against the wall. They'll have social services come by. Paperwork questions, you know how it goes. Will they take him? Maybe temporarily, but don't worry yet. I nodded, though my stomach sank. The idea of strangers deciding his fate felt unbearable. If he's Daniel's, I said slowly, then he's my grandson. Rhonda's eyebrows lifted. That's a big if. I know what I saw, Rhonda. I know what I feel. She studied me for a moment. Then fight for him. I stayed until the sun rose high, painting gold over the white walls. The nurses bustled, monitors beeped, life continued. I bent close to Eli and whispered, they'll try to take you away, but I won't let them. My voice trembled, but I meant every word. Your family, and family doesn't let go. When I stepped outside the hospital, the air was crisp, smelling of rain-soaked leaves. Across the parking lot, a silver sedan turned the corner, a flash of sunlight on its hood. My breath caught. The same model, same color. The driver's window rolled down for just a second, and I thought I saw her face. Maya. Watching. Then the car accelerated, vanishing into the traffic. I stood there frozen, the sound of the engine echoing in my ears. She knew I had him. And for the first time I realized this wasn't over. It was only beginning. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Maya's face behind the windshield, those sharp eyes watching me from the parking lot. I sat by the window until dawn, a cup of cold tea, untouched, beside me. When the first light broke across the trees, I got dressed and drove back to the hospital. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there waiting for her moment. Rhonda met me at the nurse's station. She looked tired but kind, her dark hair tied up in a loose bun. "You're back early," she said. I couldn't stay away. "You shouldn't be here all day again," she warned softly. "You need rest." "I'll rest when he's safe," I replied. She sighed but didn't argue. Together we walked down the corridor toward the neonatal ward. The beeping of machines had become oddly comforting, a steady rhythm that reminded me Eli was still fighting. Through the glass I saw him asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling beneath the tangle of tubes. The doctors said he was stable, but my heart refused to believe it until I saw him breathe with my own eyes. I pressed my hand against the window and whispered, "Grandma's here." His eyelids fluttered as if he heard me. Detective Laura appeared behind me, her reflection overlapping mine in the glass. "Morning, Mrs. Ward," she said quietly. "May we talk?" I turned. "Did you find her?" "Not yet," Laura replied. Her voice carried the weight of bad news. Her car was found abandoned near Highway 7 last night. No fingerprints, no wallet, no phone. "She's running. Looks that way." Laura opened a small notebook. "We did find something in the trunk, a pair of women's shoes soaked in lake water, and what looks like bloodstains. They're being tested." I felt my stomach twist. "Blood, we don't know whose yet." She studied me carefully. "Mrs. Ward, has your daughter-in-law ever shown signs of instability, mood swings, depression, violent outbursts?" I almost laughed. "She's always been unstable, Detective. Just very good at hiding it." Laura didn't smile. "We're also reviewing your late son's case. His car accident. There were some inconsistencies in the report." My heart stumbled. "What kind of inconsistencies?" She hesitated, choosing her words. "It might be nothing, but the brake lines showed signs of tampering." For a moment, the hallway spun. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. "You're saying the crash wasn't an accident?" "We're saying we're not ruling anything out." I couldn't breathe. The image of Daniel's car mangled against that tree flashed behind my eyes. The rain that night, the phone call, the disbelief that turned into a lifetime of grief. I'd accepted it because I had to. But now, standing in this sterile hallway, the world tilted again. Maya. Her tears at the funeral, her trembling hands clutching mine, her whispered words, "He loved you so much." Lies, all of it. "I knew it," I whispered. Laura lowered her voice. "If she killed him, we'll prove it. But I need you to be careful, don't let her contact you." "She already has," I said before I could stop myself. Laura's eyes sharpened. "What do you mean? I saw her car here yesterday. She was watching." The detective's jaw tightened. "You should have called us immediately." "I wasn't sure it was her." "I am now." "Then she knows you found the baby," Laura said grimly. "She'll come back for him." When Laura left, I went back into the NICU. I sat beside the glass, my thoughts storming. Daniel's voice echoed in my memory, his laugh, his easy charm, his faith in people. He believed Maya could change. He used to say, "She just needs someone to believe in her." Mom, I had believed in him. And he had died for it. Rhonda joined me with a fresh cup of coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," I murmured. I told her about the brake lines, about the blood, about everything Laura said. Rhonda listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned forward and took my hand. "Then that baby's all that's left of him," she said softly. I nodded, my throat closing. "And she's trying to erase even that." "Then you fight," Rhonda said. "You've got more fire than half this hospital combined." That afternoon, a woman from social services arrived, young, blonde, too polished for a place full of pain. She introduced herself as Aline Moore. "I'm here to discuss the custody arrangements for the infant," she said in a tone that felt both professional and detached. "I'm his grandmother," I said, before she could sit down. Aline blinked. "That hasn't been confirmed." "It will be," she offered a rehearsed smile. "Until then, the baby remains under state supervision." Once he's cleared medically, we'll arrange a temporary foster placement. The words hit me like ice water. You're taking him, it's standard procedure, she said, flipping through her clipboard. You're not a registered foster guardian, and we can't leave him in a medical facility indefinitely. He's family, I said, trying to steady my voice. He belongs with me. I understand how you feel, Mrs. Ward, but no, I cut in, my voice rising. You don't understand. That baby was thrown into a lake to die. I pulled him out. I saved him. He's alive because of me. Aline's calm expression didn't waver, but I saw something flicker in her eyes, pity maybe. If DNA confirms your relation, you can petition for guardianship. Until then, he'll be placed in state care. Placed, I repeated, tasting the word like poison. Like a package, she stood smoothing her skirt. I'll keep you informed. When she was gone, I stood in the doorway of the NICU, staring at Eli's small body wrapped in wires. My reflection hovered over him on the glass. I saw the wrinkles at my mouth, the gray in my hair, the exhaustion that had become part of me. They think I can't do it, I whispered. They think I'm too old. He stirred just slightly, and I smiled. They're wrong. As I left the hospital that evening, the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the lake into a sheet of molten gold. I stopped by the edge, the wind cold against my face. The same spot where I'd pulled that suitcase out of the water. The surface looked peaceful now, hiding the horror beneath. Somewhere out there Maya was alive, running, plotting. And if the detective was right, she'd killed my son and tried to kill her own child. I picked up a small stone and threw it into the water. The ripples spread, catching the fading light. You didn't win, I whispered into the dusk. You won't ever win. Behind me, a car door slammed somewhere up the road. I turned sharply, but there was only silence. My pulse pounded in my ears. The wind rustled through the trees, sounding almost like footsteps. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the gathering dark before forcing myself back into the car. I locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove home, I glanced in the rearview mirror more times than I could count. Every pair of headlights behind me felt like hers. Every shadow on the side of the road looked like someone waiting. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the tea in my stomach felt like stone. I went straight to my son's study, the one I hadn't touched since his death. His books were still on the shelf, his handwriting still on a note left by the lamp. I ran my fingers over it. For Mom, don't forget to breathe. I sat in his chair and let the tears come. I cried for him, for the baby in that hospital crib, for the years I'd spent pretending the worst was behind me. But most of all, I cried, because I finally understood this wasn't just grief anymore, it was war. And I wasn't going to lose again. The phone rang just after sunrise. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a teacup, when the shrill sound cut through the stillness of the house. For a moment I thought it might be Rhonda, or Detective Lara with news. But when I picked up a man's voice I didn't recognize, spoke my name. Mrs. Ward, this is Dr. Grayson from County General. You should come in. There's been a development with the infant. My stomach dropped. Is he? He's stable, the doctor said quickly. But we've completed the first round of DNA testing and there's something you'll want to see. I didn't even bother changing out of my robe. 10 minutes later I was in my car, tires crunching on the gravel road as I sped toward the hospital. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Dr. Grayson met me outside his office, holding a manila folder thick with papers. He gestured for me to sit, then closed the door. We ran a DNA comparison using the hair sample you provided from your son's belongings, he said, flipping the folder open. The results are conclusive. The infant shares approximately 25% of your genetic markers. I stared at him. What does that mean exactly? It means, he said gently, he's your grandson, Mrs. Ward. The words hit me like a physical blow. For a second I couldn't breathe. I felt the room tilt, the edges blur. Daniel's son, I whispered. Doctor. Grayson nodded. Yes. Based on the baby's age, he would have been conceived roughly 7 months before your son's death. My hand flew to my mouth. She was pregnant. It appears so. Did your daughter-in-law ever mention it? Never, I said, the disbelief thick in my voice. Not once. He slid the papers toward me, the black lines of data and charts swimming in front of my eyes. This should help your case with social services. You're the closest living relative. I looked at the signature line, my own name, beside words I didn't understand. It was too much to process, the grief, the betrayal, the shock. "Thank you, doctor," I managed to say. "You've given me something I didn't think I'd have again, proof." When I stepped out into the hallway, Rhonda was waiting, holding 2 coffees. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "I have," I murmured. "He's Daniel's. He's my grandson." Her mouth fell open. "You're sure?" The test confirmed it. She grinned, tears pooling in her eyes. "Then that baby's exactly where he belongs." I wished I could share her joy, but my heart felt heavy. If the baby was Daniel's, then Maya had hidden the pregnancy for months. She'd lied to everyone, including him. And then she'd tried to destroy the only part of him that remained. Detective Laura found me in the cafeteria a few hours later. She moved with the brisk energy of someone who hadn't slept. "I heard about the results," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "That changes everything." "How?" "It means motive," she said. "If your son's will left his assets to his future children and Maya knew she was pregnant, that could explain her actions. She might have realized too late that she couldn't access anything until after the baby was born and alive." I frowned. "So she killed him for money, then tried to kill her own child for the same reason?" "Possibly. But we'll need proof." Laura leaned closer. "We've reopened Daniel's case as a homicide. His car wasn't just damaged by the crash. The brake lines were deliberately cut. Maya's name is now officially on our suspect list." The words made my heart stutter. I stared at the table, tracing a small scratch in the surface. "He trusted her," I whispered. "He married her. He thought she loved him." Laura's gaze softened. "People like her know how to mimic love. But don't blame yourself for not seeing it. That's what predators count on." Before she left, Laura handed me her card again. "We're tracking financial records, offshore accounts, insurance policies. If she tries to move money, we'll find her." I turned the card over in my hand. "You really think she's still out there?" "I don't think," Laura said. "I know. And she's watching." That night the wind picked up, rattling the windows of my house. I sat in the living room, lights dimmed, the baby's DNA report spread across the coffee table. The house creaked with every gust of wind, and each sound made me flinch. I'd locked all the doors twice, but I still felt exposed. The phone rang again around 10. I hesitated before answering. "Mrs. Ward," Aline Moore's voice came through, too bright, too polite. "I've reviewed your case. With the DNA confirmation, the court can now consider temporary guardianship. Then he can come home with me." "Not yet. The process takes time. There will be home inspections, psychological evaluations, financial documentation." "I'm 62, I snapped. "Not senile. I understand, but the system requires." "Your system nearly let his mother drown him." There was a pause. When she spoke again, her voice was measured. "We're doing everything we can to ensure the child's safety. Please cooperate, Mrs. Ward. We're on the same side." I hung up without replying. After that, I sat in silence, the clock ticking loud enough to fill the room. On the mantel, Daniel's picture watched me, his smile frozen in time. "She killed you," I said softly. "And she'll pay for it." The anger that had been simmering inside me for months began to burn hotter, steadier. I wasn't just grieving anymore, I was preparing. I turned on the lamp in Daniel's old study and began searching through his papers. He'd kept everything: receipts, letters, photos. Near the bottom of a drawer, I found a small leather notebook, worn and faded. His handwriting filled the pages, looping and uneven. I flipped through until I found the entries from his last few weeks. One sentence stopped me cold. "She's changed since I told her about the will. I think she knows. I don't feel safe in the car with her anymore." My breath caught. I flipped to the next page. "If anything happens to me, Mom will know what to do." The notebook slipped from my fingers, landing open on the desk. I sank into his chair, trembling. He had known. My son had sensed it, and he'd left me this breadcrumb trail to the truth. I stared at the pages, the ink smudged in places by his thumb, the words now both a warning and a cry for justice. When the tears finally came, they weren't the helpless ones I'd shed at his funeral. These were sharper, cleaner, fueled by something new. Determination. I picked up the notebook, clutching it to my chest. "I know what to do," I whispered into the dark. "And I'm not stopping until she's gone." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of something metallic, a car door closing in the distance. I froze, listening. The road below my house was empty, swallowed by night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there watching from the shadows. I closed the curtains and double-locked the door. Then I sat by the window, the notebook on my lap, waiting for morning to come. The house was too quiet the next morning. Even the ticking clock sounded nervous, skipping slightly between seconds. I brewed coffee but didn't drink it. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, felt suspicious. My mind kept circling the same thought she knew. Maya knew that I had her child, that the police were closing in, and she wouldn't disappear quietly. At 9, I drove back to the hospital, gripping the steering wheel tight enough to whiten my knuckles. I kept checking the rearview mirror, scanning every car that followed me longer than it should. The autumn fog hung low over the road, turning everything gray. I caught a glimpse of a silver sedan twice before I turned into the hospital parking lot. It vanished behind a delivery truck. Inside, Rhonda greeted me with her usual smile, but there was tension behind it. "You look pale, Evelyn," she said. "I'm fine," I lied. She didn't believe me. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" "Not much." She touched my arm. "You'll burn out before this is over." "I can't rest." "Not yet." Eli was stronger that morning. His cheeks were rosier, his breathing steady, his small fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. I stood beside the crib, tears stinging the back of my eyes. "You're a fighter," I whispered. "Just like your daddy, doctor." Grayson stopped by a few minutes later, clipboard in hand. "He's improving faster than we expected," he said. "You can hold him today if you'd like." I froze. "Hold him, of course. Just wash your hands and the nurse will help you." It felt like something sacred. When the nurse placed him in my arms, everything inside me went still. He was so light I could barely feel his weight, but the warmth of his small body seeped through my chest like sunlight. His tiny breath brushed against my neck. For a moment, all the fear, all the rage disappeared. "Hi, sweetheart," I murmured. "I'm your grandma." The word caught in my throat, grandma. It felt like both a gift and a burden. I rocked him gently, his heartbeat faint against my palm. I thought of Daniel as a baby, how he used to fall asleep on my shoulder, and how I'd thought those days were gone forever. Aline Moore arrived around noon, her clipboard as polished as her posture. "Mrs. Ward," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "I wanted to follow up on your guardianship case." "I'm not letting him go," I said before she could start. Her expression didn't change. "I understand your concern, but procedures must be followed. You'll need to pass a home inspection and complete a psychological evaluation before the court grants temporary custody. I already cleaned the house." She gave a small smile. "It's not about cleanliness, Mrs. Ward. It's about proving you can provide a stable environment for an infant." "I raised one already," I snapped. "He became a good man. You might have read about him. He's the one your system let die in an accident." The young woman's face softened for a second, but her voice remained steady. "I know this is difficult. I'm not your enemy. I'm just following the law." When she left, Rhonda leaned in the doorway. "She's not wrong, you know. The law moves slow, but it moves." "I don't have time for slow," I said. "Maya's out there." Rhonda crossed her arms. "And what exactly are you planning to do?" "Whatever it takes." That afternoon, Detective Laura called. "I need you to come down to the precinct," she said. "We've found something." I hesitated. "Is it her?" "Just come, Mrs. Ward. Bring the notebook your son left." The drive into town felt longer than usual. The police station sat on a corner near the courthouse, gray and square, smelling faintly of rain and old paper. Laura met me in her office, where crime scene photos covered a corkboard, Daniel's car, the tree, the wreckage. I had to look away. "We recovered footage from a gas station on Route 6, she said. 2 days before your son's accident, Maya's car was there. She was arguing with a man named Daryl Quinn, a mechanic. We traced payments from her bank account, $5,000 transferred to him the same day your son died." "She paid him," I whispered. Laura nodded. "We think she hired him to tamper with the car. And the man in custody, he's talking. He says she promised him another $5,000 after the accident went through." My hands curled into fists. So she murdered my son and tried to murder her child. For money. Looks that way, Laura said quietly. But we still don't have her. She's off the grid. No phone, no cards. She's careful. I stared at the photos again, the twisted metal of my son's car, the rain-slick road, the blood on the airbag. It was all there, the truth I had refused to see for too long. You'll find her, I said finally. We will, Laura replied. But until we do, you need to be careful. If she contacts you, I'll call you, I promised. But I already knew I wouldn't wait for the police if that day came. That night when I returned home, the air felt thick with silence. I double-checked the locks, closed every curtain, and sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's notebook open in front of me. The pages smelled faintly of his cologne, faded but familiar. I ran my fingers over his handwriting, whispering each word like a prayer. She's different since I told her about the baby. I changed my will to protect him. If anything happens to me, Mom will know what to do. I closed my eyes. I know what to do, I whispered back. I'll protect him. A sudden knock at the door made me jump. 3 sharp raps. I hesitated, every nerve alert. Who's there? I called. No answer. I waited a few seconds, then slowly approached. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. Then faintly the crunch of footsteps retreating down the gravel path. I opened the door, a crack, the cold air biting my face. There was a small envelope on the porch, pale against the wooden planks. I picked it up with trembling hands. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. My breath caught. It was the baby Eli sleeping in his hospital crib, taken through the window. On the back, a single line scrawled in red ink, "He's mine." The photo slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the floor. I stumbled backward, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. Maya had been there. Inside the hospital. Watching him. I grabbed the phone, dialing Lara's number with shaking hands. She answered on the second ring. Detective Monroe. She was here, I said, breathless. Maya. She left a photo. Stay inside, Lara ordered. Lock everything. I'm sending a car right now. But I barely heard her. My eyes were on the window where the reflection of my own face stared back, pale, frightened, and framed by the darkness outside. Somewhere out there she was smiling. I could feel it. The red and blue lights from the patrol cars painted my living room walls in pulses of color. 2 officers combed the porch with flashlights, while another took the envelope in a plastic evidence bag. I sat on the couch, clutching a blanket around my shoulders, even though the room was warm. Detective Lara arrived 20 minutes later, her coat still damp from the rain. Let me see the picture, she said. I pointed to the table where the officer had placed it. She put on gloves, picked up the Polaroid, and stared at it for a long moment. Taken through a hospital window, she murmured. Probably within the last 12 hours. She was there, I said. You said the police had guards at the neonatal ward. They do, Lara replied, but if she disguised herself, nurse scrubs, cleaning staff, it wouldn't be hard to slip in for a minute. My stomach churned. She's not just watching anymore, she's taunting me. That's good, Lara said grimly. It means she's getting desperate, desperate. The word echoed through my head long after the officers left. I stood by the window, staring out at the driveway where the rain pooled into shallow puddles. The night smelled like wet earth and cold metal. I used to love the sound of rain against the glass. Now it only made me feel trapped. Rhonda called around midnight. They told me about the photo, she said softly. Are you all right? I don't know. Eli's fine. They moved him to a secure floor. Only staff with special clearance can get near him now. I exhaled shakily. Thank God. You did the right thing calling Lara. Don't blame yourself. Maya's unraveling. She'll slip soon. I just want this to end, I whispered. It will, she said. And when it does, you'll finally breathe again. But breathing felt impossible. Sleep didn't come. I wandered the house until dawn, checking locks, peering through blinds. Every noise outside sounded like footsteps. I even thought I saw a shadow move near the fence, though when I turned on the porch light, there was nothing there but falling rain. The next morning, Lara showed up with coffee and a folder. Her tired eyes told me she hadn't slept either. We traced the photo, she said, dropping into the chair across from me. The paper used is from an instant camera brand sold in only 3 stores nearby. One of them had a purchase 2 days ago, cash no receipt, but the clerk remembers a woman with blonde hair and a scar near her jawline. Maya, I breathed. Likely, Lara confirmed, we're running security footage. She hesitated. There's something else. We've confirmed a wire transfer from one of Daniel's joint accounts to an offshore bank just days before his death. Guess whose signature was on the authorization? Maya's. She forged his name. The same pattern showed up in an insurance claim filed after his death. That money's gone, moved through dummy corporations and impossible to trace. But the point is, she's been planning this for a long time. I felt numb. She killed my son, stole his money, and tried to erase his child. For what control? Lara said simply. It's always about control. That night the sky cleared for the first time in weeks. I sat on the porch, the same porch where I'd first seen her by the lake, and tried to piece everything together. The will, the money, the lies, it was a web, and every thread led back to her. Somewhere out there Maya was moving, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. The phone rang again just after 10. My first thought was Lara, but when I answered, silence greeted me. I was about to hang up when a familiar voice said almost playfully, "You're a hard woman to scare, Evelyn." My blood turned to ice. "Maya, you should have left things alone," she said. "You think you're saving that baby, but all you're doing is keeping him from me." "You tried to kill him," I hissed. "I changed my mind." Her tone was calm, almost conversational. "He's all I have left of Daniel now, and of his money, of course. You'll never touch him." "Oh, I will. And when I do, I'll make sure you watch." The line went dead. I stood there frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear. My reflection in the dark window looked like someone else, older, harder, more dangerous. I called Lara immediately, relaying every word. She told me to stay put, to let her handle it. But as I hung up, I knew waiting wasn't enough anymore. I grabbed Daniel's old journal from the desk and flipped through it again, hoping for something I'd missed. Halfway through, I found a folded page tucked between the entries, a receipt from a storage facility on the edge of town dated the week before his death. My pulse quickened. He had hidden something. Maybe proof, maybe her undoing. I drove there before I could second-guess myself. The facility sat behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The night guard barely looked up as I signed in and walked down the long corridor of metal doors. The unit number on the receipt, 47B, was halfway down. The air smelled of dust and oil. My hands shook as I turned the key in the padlock. The door groaned open. Inside were boxes stacked neatly along the wall. I knelt, opening the first one. Old clothes. The second held photo albums, letters, a few tools. The third stopped my breath. It was full of manila envelopes labeled with Daniel's handwriting, insurance, will, contracts. At the bottom, a smaller envelope marked "For Mom." My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a flash drive and a note. "If anything happens to me, this will explain why. Don't trust her." I didn't wait. I locked the unit again and drove straight home. My fingers fumbled as I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The screen flickered, then opened a folder of videos. The first file was dated 2 days before the crash. Daniel's face appeared tired, wary, but resolute. "Mom," he said into the camera, his voice breaking. "If you're watching this, something's happened. Maya's been lying to me. She knew about the pregnancy for months. She's been pressuring me to change the will, but I already did. Everything goes to the baby now. I think she found out. I've seen her making calls, whispering when she thinks I'm asleep. Last night I found messages to a mechanic, Daryl Quinn. I think she's planning something with the car. If anything happens to me, don't let her near the baby. Promise me, Mom, please. Promise me." I sat back, tears blurring the screen. "I promise," I whispered. Then through the open window I heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. My heart lurched. Headlights swept across the wall. Slowly I reached over and turned off the lamp. The car idled in the driveway for a moment, then the engine cut. Silence. I crept toward the window and peered through the blinds. A figure stood by the gate just beyond the glow of the streetlight. Small, slim, wearing a hooded jacket. Even from a distance I knew that posture, that tilt of the head. Maya. She stood there for several seconds, staring up at the house. Then, as if sensing me, she smiled just a faint curve of her lips, and walked back into the dark. I stayed by the window until the first light of dawn. She was hunting me now. But I had something she didn't, a truth she couldn't bury, and I was done being afraid. The morning came gray and cold, the kind that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I hadn't slept at all. The flash drive still lay on the table beside the laptop, Daniel's voice echoing in my head with every passing hour. I could almost see his face, tired but determined, warning me through time itself. He'd known she'd come for him, and he'd left that message for me, his last act of love and trust. By 8, Detective Lara was at my door. I let her in without a word. She looked as exhausted as I felt. "I got your message," she said, dropping her bag on the table. "You said you found something." I handed her the flash drive. "It's from Daniel's storage unit. He recorded himself 2 days before the crash. You need to see it." She plugged it into her laptop and we watched together. Daniel's image filled the screen again, his voice quiet but resolute. When it ended, Lara closed her eyes for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "This is huge," she said. "It confirms everything: intent, motive, timeline. She knew about the pregnancy, she knew about the will, and she planned to kill him for it." "She's already tried to kill me," I said quietly. "She won't stop until she gets the baby." Lara nodded. "Then we stop her first." She opened her notebook. "The car you saw last night, silver sedan, right?" "Yes. We found tire tracks near your fence. Same tread pattern as Maya's vehicle. She's been circling your property." "Then why haven't you caught her yet?" "We're close," she said. "She can't run forever. She's running out of money and people to hide with. We've placed surveillance near the lake and the hospital. If she shows up, we'll know." I wanted to believe her. But belief felt like a luxury. I spent the day pacing, jumping at every sound. The wind rattled the gutters. A branch scraped across the window like fingernails. At dusk, I went outside with a flashlight and checked every lock again. When I turned back toward the porch, something glinted in the flower bed, a small piece of metal half buried in the soil. I knelt and pulled it out. It was a camera lens detached from a tiny black casing. A spy cam. My hands shook as I carried it inside and set it on the table. Lara came within 20 minutes. She examined it with gloved fingers. "She's been watching you," she said grimly. "There are mounting points on this. It was hidden intentionally. We'll sweep the property for more." "God," I whispered. "All this time she's been inside my life, even when I couldn't see her." Lara's eyes hardened. "She's unraveling Evelyn. Desperate people get sloppy. We'll use that." After the officers left, I sat in Daniel's study and stared at his photo. "She's still out there," I murmured. "And she's getting closer." The house creaked softly in the wind. Somewhere outside a dog barked and then went silent. The quiet felt wrong, like the pause before thunder. Around midnight my phone buzzed. A text message. "Do you want to know the truth about your son?" There was no number, just the message. My pulse hammered. Another one appeared seconds later. "Meet me where it all began." The lake. I called Lara immediately. "She just texted me," I said. "She wants me to come to the lake." "Don't go," Lara said sharply. "We'll set up a perimeter. Forward the messages to me, and stay inside." But as I stared out the window toward the dark silhouette of the trees, I knew Maya wouldn't wait forever. She wanted me alone, and if I didn't go, she might vanish again, maybe with Eli next time. I didn't tell Lara I was leaving. I just grabbed my coat, Daniel's journal, and the flashlight. The night air was cold and sharp as glass. The road to the lake was slick with mist, the moon hiding behind clouds. Every turn of the wheel brought back the memory of that day, the silver car, the splash, the scream I hadn't been able to release. When I reached the clearing, the lake was still as a sheet of obsidian. The trees whispered in the wind, their reflections shivering in the water. I stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. "Maya," I called. "I'm here." No answer. Only the soft lap of waves against the shore. I took a few steps forward, the flashlight cutting through the fog. That's when I saw it, a figure standing near the water's edge, her reflection long and distorted. Blonde hair caught the faint light, her face pale beneath the hood. "You shouldn't have come alone," she said. "You gave me no choice." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You always had a choice. You could have let it go. You could have let me have what's mine. What's yours? I spat. You mean the money you killed my son for, the baby you tried to drown? Her voice dropped low. You don't understand, Evelyn. Daniel was going to ruin everything. He wasn't supposed to change the will. I wasn't supposed to have a baby. It wasn't part of the plan. He trusted you. He pitied me, she snapped. You think I didn't see the way he looked at me, like I was some fragile thing he needed to fix? I didn't want to be his charity project. The flashlight trembled in my hand. So you murdered him. Her eyes flashed with something like pride. He left me no choice. He was going to take everything: money, reputation, control. I made sure he couldn't. And the baby, a thin smile curved her lips. A liability. I thought if he was gone I could start over. But then that child screamed the moment he was born. I couldn't do it. I couldn't kill him. Not completely. You left him to die. I left him to fate. For a moment all I heard was the soft hum of the wind. Then headlights flared in the distance. Maya's head snapped toward them. You called the cops, she hissed. I didn't, I said, but my voice wavered. She stepped closer, pulling something from her pocket. The metallic click was unmistakable, a gun. Then you'll pay for his death the same way he did. I froze, heart hammering. Maya, please. Her finger twitched on the trigger. But before she could aim, a voice shouted from the darkness. Drop it. Laura's command echoed across the water. The woods erupted with movement, flashlights shouting, boots pounding on gravel. Maya turned toward the noise, and in that split second I lunged. I grabbed her wrist, the gun firing wild into the air. The sound tore through the night, scattering birds from the trees. We struggled, our feet sliding in the mud. She was younger, stronger, but I had something she didn't: rage, sharpened by grief. I wrenched the weapon from her hand, just as Laura's officers swarmed in, tackling Maya to the ground. She screamed as they cuffed her, thrashing like a trapped animal. He was mine, she shrieked. You stole him from me. I stood there shaking, mud streaked on my hands. You stole him first, I said. Laura came to me, breathing hard. Are you hurt? No, I said faintly. Just tired. As they dragged Maya toward the patrol car, she turned her head and gave me a smile that made my blood run cold. This isn't over, she whispered. But for the first time in months, I didn't believe her. The lake was quiet again. The fog began to lift, revealing the faint blush of dawn on the horizon. Laura put a hand on my shoulder. It's over, Evelyn, she said softly. You did it. I looked out at the still water, at the place where it had all begun, and let the tears fall. No, I said. He did. And in that reflection, gray, trembling but alive, I saw Daniel's eyes staring back at me, proud and peaceful at last. I woke to sunlight for the first time in weeks. It spilled through the curtains in pale gold bands, touching the photographs on the wall. Daniel as a child, Daniel in his graduation gown, Daniel on his wedding day. The air in the house felt still, as though it too was waiting to see what would happen next. For the first time since that awful day at the lake, there were no police outside, no phone calls in the night, no whispers from the shadows. Maya was in custody. It should have felt like victory, but all I felt was hollow relief. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling above the mug. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face at the lake, the wild, empty look in her eyes as she screamed that he was hers. Even in handcuffs, she'd looked like someone who believed the story she'd created. A woman convinced she was the victim of her own crimes. The phone rang just as I took my first sip. Mrs. Ward, the voice was familiar. It was Laura. I wanted to update you personally. Maya was formally charged this morning with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and multiple counts of fraud. She's being transferred to state custody. Will there be a trial? I asked quietly. Yes. It may take months, maybe longer, but the evidence is overwhelming. Between the confession at the lake, your son's recording, and the financial records, she doesn't have a chance. I stared out the window at the maple trees, swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing will bring him back, I said. Laura's voice softened. No, but now he has justice. And that little boy has a future. After the call ended, I sat in silence, the weight of those words sinking in. Justice. It didn't feel like something I could hold or see. It was an invisible victory, one that left scars behind. Around noon, Rhonda stopped by with lunch. She looked more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. "You look better," she said as she unpacked the sandwiches. "A little color in your face again." "I slept," I admitted. "Barely, but it's a start." She smiled. "That's something." We ate in quiet companionship. Every so often she'd glance at me waiting for me to talk, but I didn't know where to start. Finally I said, "Do you believe people like her can be born that way, or do they become monsters slowly?" Rhonda folded her napkin carefully. "I think some people are missing the part that makes them see others as real. To Maya, people were tools. She used Daniel, and when he stopped being useful, she removed him. She killed him because he loved her," I said bitterly. "She killed him because he stopped serving her story," Rhonda replied. "You, on the other hand, refused to play your part." I thought about that for a long time after she left. When the sun dipped lower, I drove to the hospital. The guards at the entrance recognized me now. They smiled and waved me through. In the neonatal ward, the air was soft and warm, humming with machines that sounded like a heartbeat. Eli was in a small crib now, not the incubator, and when he saw me, his mouth curled into something that almost looked like a smile. "You're safe now," I whispered, lifting him gently. He was heavier than before, stronger. His tiny hands grasped my finger, and I thought of Daniel again, his stubbornness, his warmth, the way he used to cradle my hand when he was small. "You're your father's son," I said, my voice trembling. "You survived her." Aline, the social worker, entered quietly behind me. "Mrs. Ward," she said, her tone softer than usual. "I heard about the arrest. I'm glad." "So am I." She hesitated, then pulled out a folder. "We've received the court's notice. Given the circumstances and with DNA confirmation, you're eligible to apply for emergency guardianship. The hearing is in 2 weeks." My breath caught. "You mean I could take him home, if the judge approves?" "Yes. You've already passed the medical and background checks. You'll need to complete the childcare certification, but that's just a formality now." I felt tears sting my eyes. "He'll finally have a home." Aline smiled faintly. "He already does, Mrs. Ward. He just doesn't know it yet." That night I sat in Daniel's old room. The air smelled faintly of paint and wood polish from the crib I'd assembled days before. I'd replaced his posters with soft yellow walls, a small mobile hanging from the ceiling, and a rocking chair by the window. It felt strange transforming the space that once belonged to my son into a sanctuary for his son, but it also felt right. As though Daniel himself had guided my hands. While I rocked slowly, I imagined what he would say if he could see us now. He'd tease me for worrying too much, tell me to rest, tell me that Maya could never take away what mattered most. Love, family, memory. The next morning Laura called again. "There's one more thing," she said. "During the evidence review, we found a letter in Maya's apartment. It's addressed to you." My pulse quickened. "To me, it's been processed and cleared for prints. I can deliver it if you'd like." "Bring it." When she arrived, she handed me a sealed envelope, the paper thick and creased. My name was written across it in Maya's sharp handwriting. I turned it over twice before opening it. "Evelyn, you think you've won. You think locking me away means you're safe. But people like you never are. You've always had to control everything, even Daniel. You made him weak. You turned him into you. I just finished what you started. You'll raise that child to be just like him, obedient, soft, foolish. He'll die the same way, trusting someone who doesn't deserve it. You can't protect him forever." The letter slipped from my hands. I couldn't read the rest. Laura took it gently, her jaw tightening. "We'll keep this on file. Don't let it get in your head." But it already had. Her words crawled under my skin like insects. The thought that even from behind bars she still had a way to wound me was unbearable. After Laura left, I burned the letter in the fireplace. The paper curled and blackened the ink, turning to ash. I watched until it was gone, until the flames ate every trace of her voice. "You're done," I whispered. "You don't exist here anymore." The next morning I drove back to the lake. It was calm, the water glinting under the early sun. The same spot where everything had begun now looked almost peaceful. Birds skimmed the surface, reeds swayed in the breeze. I knelt at the edge and tossed a handful of wildflowers into the water. For you, Daniel, I said softly. For the boy who deserved better, and for the man who fought to protect what was good. I stayed there for a long time until the petals drifted out of sight. When I finally stood, I felt lighter. The grief was still there, but it no longer owned me. Back home, I placed a framed photo of Daniel and Eli on the mantle, my son and his son, side by side. We're still here, I whispered, smiling through the tears. And we always will be. For the first time in months, I didn't look over my shoulder when I turned off the light. The ghosts in the house had gone quiet, and in their place came something I'd forgotten how to feel: peace. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. I sat in the hallway clutching my purse like it contained my whole life. In a way it did: birth certificates, photographs, the court petition for guardianship of Eli, every scrap of evidence that tied me to him. Outside rain tapped steadily against the tall windows, soft and rhythmic, like a metronome counting down to the moment that would decide both our futures. Aline appeared first, smiling politely, her shoes clicking against the marble floor. The judge is reviewing your file now, she said. Everything looks strong. You've done all the training, your evaluations came back excellent, and everyone from the hospital wrote glowing letters about you. I tried to smile back. It still doesn't feel real, I said quietly. She softened. It will once you hold him again. Inside the courtroom, the air was still. The judge, a middle-aged woman with calm gray eyes, sat behind a desk cluttered with folders. Mrs. Ward, she began, her tone neutral but not unkind, I've reviewed your application and all supporting materials. You are requesting emergency guardianship of the minor child Eli Ward, pending full adoption proceedings. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. You understand that this role comes with full parental responsibilities, medical, financial, and legal. Are you prepared for that? I am. Her eyes softened slightly. You're 62 years old, Mrs. Ward. Raising a newborn is demanding. I know, I said, my voice steady. But I raised one already. I know what it takes. There was a long pause. The judge turned a page in her folder, then looked back up. According to testimony from Detective Laura Monroe and hospital staff, you not only rescued this child, but have been instrumental in solving his father's homicide. That is commendable. But tell me, why do you want to do this? The question hung in the air like a test. My throat tightened. Because he's all that's left of my son, I said softly. Because I made a promise to Daniel and to myself that I would keep him safe. I don't want him to grow up not knowing love, not knowing where he came from. He deserves more than the world gave his parents. The judge nodded slowly. Then she set her pen down and leaned forward. That's all I needed to hear. Her gavel struck once. Guardianship granted, effective immediately. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder and sunlight all at once. Aline touched my arm, smiling. Congratulations, Mrs. Ward, she whispered. You did it. At the hospital, Rhonda was waiting outside Eli's room, her smile wide and warm. I heard the news, she said. He's all yours now. Mine, I repeated softly. The word felt strange on my tongue, fragile, beautiful. When she handed him to me, something inside me finally unclenched. Eli's eyes fluttered open, dark and curious, and for a heartbeat I swore he looked just like Daniel. We're going home, sweetheart, I whispered. Home. The drive back felt surreal. The car seat in the rearview mirror, the soft hum of the baby sleeping, it was a silence I hadn't known in years, full and alive. I drove slowly, as if the entire world had become too precious to rush through. When we reached the house, the porch light flickered on automatically and I carried him inside. The nursery smelled faintly of lavender and new paint. I laid him gently in his crib, the mobile above him spinning with quiet music. His fingers twitched, his lips parted in a soft sigh. Watching him breathe felt like watching time restart. That night, I sat in the rocking chair beside his crib, the house quiet except for the creak of the chair and his small rhythmic breathing. I thought about everything it had taken to get here, the lake, the police, the fear, the loss, and for the first time, none of it felt like pain. It felt like purpose. A soft knock at the door startled me. I hesitated, then went to answer. It was Laura, her coat damp from the rain. Sorry to drop by so late, she said. I just wanted to bring you something. She held up a small envelope. What is it, Closure? She said simply. Inside was a copy of the final case report. I scanned the pages quickly. State verse. Maya Caldwell. Verdict. Guilty on all counts. Sentence. Life imprisonment without parole. She tried to plead insanity, Laura said quietly. The jury didn't buy it. The video from the lake sealed it. I set the paper down. It's finally over then. Legally, yes, Laura said. But I know it doesn't erase what she took. I nodded. Nothing can. But she'll never hurt him again. That's enough. Laura smiled faintly. You're stronger than anyone I've met, Evelyn. If you ever need anything, I'll call, I said. But I think I'll be okay now. After she left, I stood by the window and watched the rain ease into a light drizzle. The reflection of the nursery glowed behind me, soft, golden, alive. Daniel's photo hung on the wall above the crib, his smile, gentle, proud. I reached out and touched the frame. You did it, my love, I whispered. He's safe now. You can rest. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet routines, feeding, burping, changing diapers, rocking him to sleep. My body ached, but my heart felt lighter. Rhonda came by, often bringing food and laughter. Even Aline visited once, smiling as she watched Eli reach for the light. He's thriving, she said. You're doing wonderfully. At night, I'd sit with him on my lap and hum the lullaby I used to sing to Daniel. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the window, gray hair, tired eyes, but I didn't see an old woman anymore. I saw someone who'd survived. One evening, a letter arrived from the court. It wasn't long, just a notice informing me that adoption proceedings would begin in 60 days. Once finalized, Eli would carry my last name. My throat tightened as I read the words aloud. Eli Ward, I whispered, smiling through tears. My grandson. My son. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt alive again, like it had remembered how to breathe with us. A few weeks later, Pastor Monroe stopped by with flowers. He stood on the porch smiling kindly. I wanted to see the miracle for myself, he said. He's inside sleeping, I said softly. You've been through fire, Evelyn, he said. But you came out holding light. I smiled. It wasn't my strength, Pastor. It was his. That night, as the last light faded from the sky, I sat in the rocking chair again, watching Eli's chest rise and fall. The world outside was quiet, the lake glimmering faintly in the distance. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer, not for vengeance this time, but for peace. When the wind rustled the curtains, I thought I heard Daniel's voice in it, gentle as the night breeze. You kept your promise, Mom. I opened my eyes, smiling. Always, I said. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The first winter after the trial came quietly, like a long exhale after a storm. Snow gathered on the fence posts and rooftops, softening every sharp edge of the world. I'd wake before sunrise each morning, not out of fear anymore, but out of habit, slipping into the nursery where Eli slept. He always stirred just before dawn, as if sensing me nearby. When his eyes blinked open, dark, curious, alive, the house no longer felt haunted. It felt whole. He was 6 months old now, strong and endlessly curious. He laughed when I made faces, reached for my hair, and babbled nonsense that sounded like music. Rhonda said he was ahead of schedule, that he was fighting to live from the moment he'd taken his first breath. Every milestone felt like a miracle, a reminder that he was never supposed to survive, yet here he was, thriving. Still, the nightmares came sometimes. I'd dream of the lake, of that moment when the suitcase broke the surface. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, listening for sounds that weren't there. In the dark, I'd whisper, "You're safe. She's gone." But some part of me still expected to hear footsteps on the porch. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, Detective Laura called. "I thought you'd want to know," she said. "Maya was transferred this morning to the state penitentiary. Maximum security. She'll spend the rest of her life there." I hesitated. "Is she?" "All right, as much as a woman like that can be," Laura said. "She's been evaluated and declared sane enough to serve her sentence, but she refuses to speak to anyone. No visitors, no letters." "Good," I said softly. "Let her sit in silence." Laura paused. "You know, Evelyn, most people in your position would have walked away long ago. You stayed. You saved him." "I didn't have a choice," I said. "He's my blood. My son's blood." "Even so," Laura said gently, "you gave him a chance neither of them could have had." That matters. After she hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time watching the snow fall. The quiet reminded me of the nights Daniel and I used to stay up late talking after his father died, just two souls trying to make sense of loss. I'd thought that losing a child meant the end of love, but now I knew it wasn't. Love just changed shape. It became duty, promise, legacy. In February, I took Eli to his first doctor's visit since the adoption was finalized. The pediatrician smiled as she weighed him. "Healthy boy," she said. "You're doing a wonderful job, Mrs. Ward." I smiled back. "He makes it easy." When we left, the cold air bit at our faces, but he giggled from inside his bundled blanket. I pressed a kiss to his forehead. "You're my sunshine in winter," I whispered. That night, I went through the storage box again, the one with Daniel's things, his college photo, his wristwatch, the small leather notebook that had started everything. The pages were worn now, corners bent from how many times I'd read them. His handwriting looped across the paper like his voice frozen in ink. "Mom will know what to do." He'd trusted me to protect what he couldn't. And I had. I decided to start writing my own journal, one for Eli. Something he could read when he was old enough to understand. The first page began simply, "This is the story of how you were saved." Every night after he fell asleep, I'd write a little about Daniel, about Maya, about the lake. Not to burden him, but to give him truth. I didn't want him growing up surrounded by silence and secrets. When the time came, he would know everything, how his father had loved him, how his mother had lost herself, and how a miracle had pulled him back from the edge. By spring, the house began to feel alive again. Rhonda visited often, bringing flowers and casseroles. Pastor Monroe came by to bless the home, saying it was a place that had seen evil but chosen love. I liked that. Chosen love. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, the phone rang. It was Aline, the social worker. "Mrs. Ward, congratulations," she said. "The adoption papers have been officially recorded by the state. Eli is now in every legal sense your son." For a moment I couldn't speak. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you so much." When I hung up, I went straight to the nursery. Eli was awake, babbling softly, his tiny hands reaching toward the light, streaming through the window. I lifted him, holding him close. "It's official," I said. "You're mine now, forever." That night I took the framed photo of Daniel from the living room and placed it on the dresser beside Eli's crib. I wanted my son to grow up seeing his father's face every day, to know the man who'd loved him enough to change his will to fight for him even after death. Weeks passed in quiet rhythm bottles, lullabies, sunlight through lace curtains. Every morning I walked Eli to the park in his stroller. People would stop us smiling, asking how old he was. I'd tell them, and they'd comment on his eyes, his laugh, how happy he seemed. No one knew the storm behind that happiness, and I preferred it that way. He deserved a normal childhood, untouched by the darkness he was born from. But one afternoon as we returned from the park, I found an envelope in the mailbox. No return address, no stamp, just my name in red ink. My stomach turned cold. I tore it open with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "He has her eyes." There was nothing else. No signature, no clue. Just those 4 words written in a sharp, familiar hand. My first instinct was panic. I called Laura immediately. "Someone left a note," I said, voice shaking. "It looks like her handwriting." "I'll send a team," she said at once. "Don't touch it." Within an hour, 2 officers arrived to collect the envelope. They assured me the prison records confirmed Maya was still behind bars. "It's probably a copycat or some sick prank," one said. But even after they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close enough to leave it there unseen. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house sounded suspicious, every gust of wind, a whisper. Around 3 in the morning I got up and checked the locks again, then stood by Eli's crib, watching his chest rise and fall. His innocence was so fragile, so unknowing of the world's cruelty. I whispered into the dark, "I'll never let anyone hurt you again. Not her, not anyone." The next morning Laura called again. "We ran handwriting analysis," she said. "It's inconclusive but unlikely to be hers. The ink and paper are standard. We'll keep a patrol car near your street for a few weeks just in case." "Thank you," I said. "I just need him safe." "He is," Laura assured me. "You've done everything right." When I hung up, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. Fear had been replaced by something stronger: resolve. I'd spent so long reacting to danger that I'd forgotten how to live without it, but I couldn't let shadows raise this child. That evening, as the sun dipped low and golden across the lake, I took Eli outside wrapped in a soft blanket. The water shimmered quietly, no longer menacing, but calm, like time itself had forgiven what happened there. I sat on the porch swing holding him close. "You'll grow up brave," I whispered. "You'll know love, not fear, and you'll never doubt that you were wanted." The wind stirred the trees, and for a heartbeat I thought I heard Daniel's laughter carried through it, light and free. I smiled. "We're okay now," I said aloud. "We're really okay." The swing creaked gently, the lake gleamed in the distance, and for the first time the world felt like it belonged to us again. The years began to pass in quiet, measured rhythm, like a song that finally found its harmony. Eli grew fast, too fast sometimes. By the time he turned 3, the nursery had become a playground of wooden blocks and toy cars, and the crib I once stood over in fear had been replaced by a little bed, shaped like a boat. Every night before he fell asleep, he would ask for a story about his daddy in the sky. I never told him everything, just that his father had been brave, kind, and loved him more than anything in the world. He'd fall asleep holding his stuffed bear, and I would sit by his bedside, brushing his hair from his forehead, whispering the same words Daniel used to say to me when he was small: "You're safe, you're loved." Sometimes I still dreamed of the lake. In the dreams it wasn't dark or terrifying anymore, it was quiet, the water calm, the sunlight glittering like hope. I would see Daniel standing there, smiling, holding Eli's tiny hand. He never spoke, but I always woke up feeling at peace. When Eli turned 4, his preschool teacher told me he was unusually observant. "He notices everything," she said with a warm smile. "He's thoughtful, gentle. You've done a wonderful job with him." I smiled back, though my throat tightened with emotion. "He does most of it himself," I said. "He's always been strong." In truth, strength had become our family's silent inheritance. Every day with him was proof that survival wasn't just about breathing, it was about choosing joy, even when the past still whispered in the corners of the house. One cold evening in late December, I received a letter from the prison. The return address was stamped clearly: State Penitentiary for Women. My hands froze above the envelope. It had been years since the last time I'd heard her name. I considered throwing it away unopened, but something in me, curiosity, maybe closure, made me tear it open. The letter was short, written in the same sharp handwriting that had haunted me once. "Evelyn, I'm dying. Cancer, they say. Stage 4. Don't pretend you don't care, you always did. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but you should know the truth. Daniel's death wasn't just about money. He found out things about me. About who I really was. You think I was born Maya Caldwell? I wasn't. I've lied about everything, even my name. You raised my son. Maybe he'll be better than I was. Maybe you'll make him good. But don't tell him lies about me. Tell him I existed, that I was real, and that I loved him once." I read the letter 3 times before setting it down. There was no signature, no return request, just that single strange plea to be remembered even as a monster. That night I sat by the fire watching the flames swallow the letter piece by piece. I didn't know if I believed her, or if she'd written it just to keep her claws in my thoughts a little longer. But as the ashes curled and rose into the air, I realized I didn't need to know. I didn't need her story to make sense, I just needed mine to continue. The next morning I took Eli to the park. The air was crisp, the ground frosted with thin ice that cracked under our boots. He ran ahead, laughing, his cheeks red from the cold. I watched him chase a flock of pigeons, his laughter echoing through the empty playground. It sounded like freedom. He stopped, suddenly turned, and ran back to me, holding a small pebble in his hand. "For Daddy," he said, solemnly. "So he knows I remember him." I knelt down, cupping his hand around the stone. "He knows, sweetheart," I said softly. "He always will." Later that evening, after I put him to bed, I sat down at my desk and opened the journal again. It had become thick with years of writing entries about milestones, fears, joy, and loss. I flipped to the last page and began to write. "She's gone, Daniel. The woman who took you from me is gone. And maybe that's mercy in its own dark way. But what matters is that your son is alive and he's good. He has your smile, your quiet kindness, your stubborn heart. He's everything you wanted him to be. Some nights I still hear the lake in my dreams. But now it sounds like peace instead of pain. Maybe that's your way of saying we made it. Maybe that's mine of saying thank you. When I finished, I closed the journal and placed it in the box with Daniel's things. One day when Eli was old enough, he would read it. He would know the truth not just about the pain, but about the love that had survived it. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the prison warden confirming Maya's death. No visitors, no funeral, no claimants. Her remains were cremated, the ashes uncollected. I stood by the kitchen window holding the letter in one hand, and Eli's drawing in the other. A crayon sketch of our house, the lake, and 3 figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun. "Goodbye," I whispered to the ghost of her name. "You'll get no more space in our story." Spring came early that year. The lake thawed quickly, reflecting a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, I took Eli there. He was 5 now, curious and full of questions. "Is this where Daddy went to heaven?" he asked as we stood by the water's edge. "Yes," I said. "But it's also where you came back to me." He frowned, trying to understand, then smiled. "Then it's a happy place." I laughed softly, brushing his hair back. "Yes, sweetheart, it's a happy place now." We threw flowers into the water, white lilies, Daniel's favorite. Eli clapped when they floated away, shouting, "Bye, Daddy, see you soon." The wind caught his voice and carried it across the surface. And for a moment I swore I saw the ripples form the shape of 2 figures, one tall, one small, walking hand in hand, before fading into light. That night, after Eli fell asleep, I stood on the porch and watched the moon reflect off the lake. I thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the blood, the fear, and realized that the story no longer belonged to tragedy. It belonged to survival, to legacy. Inside the house, the baby monitor hummed softly with Eli's breathing. I smiled, whispered a prayer of thanks, and turned off the porch light. The darkness didn't scare me anymore. It felt like home. Eli was 7 the first time he asked me to tell the story from the beginning. We were sitting by the fireplace, the one Daniel and I had built together 20 years ago, its bricks darkened with time. Outside rain whispered against the windows. He sat cross-legged on the rug, holding his favorite blanket, eyes wide and solemn in the glow of the fire. "Grandma," he said softly, "how did you find me?" For a moment I couldn't speak. I'd known this day would come, but knowing and being ready were 2 different things. His question hung in the air, tender and fearless, like only a child's curiosity can be. I took a slow breath and nodded. "All right," I said, "it's time you knew." He listened without interrupting as I told him about the lake, about the car, about the suitcase that sank beneath the water. I left out the ugliest parts, no talk of murder or money, only truth softened by love. I told him how I had heard a sound, how I ran, how I pulled him out and prayed he would breathe. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he whispered, "So Daddy helped you find me." Tears stung my eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, touching his cheek. "He led me right to you." He smiled at that, a slow, thoughtful smile. "Then I'm never alone," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And in that moment I knew he understood more than I had ever given him credit for. That night after he went to bed, I stood by the window and watched the rain fade to mist. The reflection in the glass showed an older woman lined by years and softened by love, standing in a house that had seen both horror and healing. The ghosts that once haunted it were gone, replaced by laughter that echoed down the hallway every morning when Eli ran toward me, shouting, "Breakfast, Grandma!" The next few years unfolded gently. The scars of the past faded into lessons we carried quietly. I started volunteering at the hospital once a week, helping new mothers who had no one else. Rhonda and I kept in touch, her laugh still bright and grounding as ever. Lara visited occasionally too, now a captain, still sharp, still carrying that same quiet strength. Every time she saw Eli, she'd shake her head and say, "He's a miracle." And she was right. On Eli's 10th birthday we went back to the lake. It was our tradition now: flowers for Daniel, prayers for peace, laughter for life. The water shimmered beneath a cloudless sky, the kind of blue that feels endless. Eli knelt by the shore and tossed in a handful of white lilies. "Happy birthday, Daddy," he said. "Thank you for Grandma." I looked up at the sky smiling, and thank you for him. Afterward we walked along the trail that circled the water. Eli skipped stones while I carried the picnic basket. "Grandma," he said suddenly, "when I grow up I want to help people too. Like you and Dad did." I looked down at him heart full. "You already do, sweetheart. Every day." That night I added a final page to the journal, the one I'd begun all those years ago, the one that had carried every fear and every prayer. "He's growing, Daniel. He's everything you hoped he'd be. The world tried to take him, but love won. We won. I don't dream of the lake anymore. I dream of laughter, of sunlight, of your son's voice calling me Grandma. I hope wherever you are you can see what your love began." I placed the journal back into its box with Daniel's watch and a photo of the three of us at the lake. I sealed the box, tied it with a ribbon, and wrote on top, "For Eli when he's ready." Life moved forward as it always does. Seasons turned, the garden bloomed and withered and bloomed again. Eli grew taller, faster, stronger. He started playing piano, joined a local soccer team, made friends who filled the house with noise and energy. The days were long and bright, and for once I didn't feel old, I felt alive. One evening he came home with a school assignment. "We have to write about a hero," he said. "Can I write about Daddy?" I smiled. "You can. But remember, heroes aren't just people who fight monsters. Sometimes they're people who love when it's hardest to." He grinned. "Then I'm going to write about both of you." When he read his essay at the school assembly a week later, I sat in the front row with tears streaming down my cheeks. He spoke about bravery and kindness, about second chances and family. "My dad gave me life," he said, "and my grandma gave it back to me." The room erupted in applause. Afterward, as we walked home under a golden sunset, Eli slipped his hand into mine. "Grandma," he said, "you think Daddy's proud of us?" "I don't think," I said, squeezing his fingers gently. "I know." Years later, when I was old and gray, and the world had grown quieter again, I often found myself sitting on that same porch overlooking the lake. Eli would visit on weekends. Now a young man with his father's eyes, and his mother's stubborn chin, though blessedly none of her darkness. Sometimes he'd bring flowers. Sometimes just stories about his life in the city. Every time he left, he'd hug me tight and whisper, "You saved me." And every time I'd smile and say, "No, you saved me too." The last time we visited the lake together, the sun was setting behind the trees, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson. The water glowed like a mirror, calm and eternal. Eli stood beside me, taller, now stronger, his arm steady around my shoulders. "It's beautiful," he said. "It always was," I replied. "We just couldn't see it back then." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You know, Grandma, I think Dad's here. Every time the light hits the water I feel him." I smiled. "That's because he never left." When we turned to go, I looked back one last time. The reflection of the sky rippled across the surface, and for a heartbeat I could have sworn I saw two figures standing there, a young man and a boy waving. I didn't blink, I just smiled. That night, after Eli had driven home, I sat by the fire and whispered, "We did it, Daniel. Your boy is safe, he's good, he's happy, and I'm ready to rest." If this story found its way to you, whoever you are reading it, I hope you understand that sometimes the world can be cruel, but love is stronger than fear, hope is stronger than pain. And even the darkest lake can reflect the light if you wait long enough. If you believe in second chances, in the power of love, in the way one act of courage can change everything, share this story. Leave a comment. Tell someone you believe in redemption, in family, in fighting for what's right. Because that's how stories like ours stay alive. And if my grandson ever reads this someday, I hope he knows that he was never just a survivor. He was the miracle that turned tragedy into grace.